Top 30 visits are only a piece of the puzzle in the pre-draft process, but it has been a strong correlating sign for John Schneider and the Seahawks, who they're going to draft. I'm going to be breaking it all down here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks, as always, to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Whether you're listening from Cleveland, Ohio, or Toronto, Ontario, greatly appreciate each and every one of you. We're less than 2 weeks away from the NFL draft. Top 30 visits continuing to trickle in around the league. I'm going to be taking a close look at why fans should be paying attention to these official visits leading up to the draft and ranking my 19 players that so far have been reported to the Seahawks, 1 to 19 as far as talent and projected around. Going to be a really fun episode brought your way by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. During the pre-draft process, there are a lot of different components that NFL teams have at their disposal to evaluate players. And really, this process goes throughout the entire year. Scouts are out watching players during the college football season. And then once the year is over with, you have the Senior Bowl and other all-star showcases like the Shrine Bowl, the Hulu Bowl. There's a whole bunch of them. And scouts are sent to continue evaluating these players. Then you've obviously got the combine for a select number of players, 300 plus, that get invited to Indianapolis. You have pro day workouts going on across the country. You have virtual visits. You have top 30 visits. You have local pro days, all kinds of crazy stuff going on. It's a complicated process, and it's busy work for NFL scouts and for executives like John Schneider. But when people discuss top 30 visits, just to throw this out there, I'm not a fan necessarily of the name, because this isn't the top 30 players that the Seahawks are looking at. This is not going to all be first-round caliber players or really second-round caliber players. The Seahawks are going to bring in some guys that are that caliber, but they're also going to be bringing in players that are day 2, day 3, and undrafted priority free agent candidates to take a look at those style players, especially when you don't have a second-round pick, as the Seahawks don't currently right now. That being said, this is a very important part of the process, and I think you can make the argument, at least based on recent data, that these top 30 visits have had more meaning to the Seattle Seahawks in regard to who they are going to be picking, at least for the last several years, than what it did earlier in John Schneider's tenure. Just look at the history. We're going to go back here right now, early on from 2011 to 2017. The first couple of years that John Schneider was the general manager. I don't have 2010 on here because 2011 is when these top 30 visits came into play with the new CBA. But those first couple of years, obviously, Bobby Wagner is a huge name that had a pre-draft visit with the Seahawks. He was too sick to participate in the combine, so this was a really important visit. The Seahawks were impressed. Wagner actually said that this was a rough top 30 visit for him because then linebacker coach Ken Norton Jr. just wanted to play all of his bad highlights, but they loved him. They drafted him in the second round. The rest is history. Jeremy Lane that same year was a really good special teams player that the Seahawks got in the 6th round. Then you got players like Christian Michael in 2013 that obviously that did not work out, but they fell in love with the player, meeting with him in the pre-draft process. And 2015, you had 4 players, including Frank Clark. Really, Clark and Mark Glowinski were the only 2 that ended up having NFL careers from that group. Obviously, there's some hits, there's some misses when you look at those first handful of years, but it seems like the deeper that we have gotten into John Schneider's tenure, that there has been more of an emphasis, and maybe it's just a coincidence, but it feels like these pre-draft top 30 visits, that there has been a stronger correlation in recent years where John Schneider has been drafting players that took the trip out to the VMAC and they had an extra opportunity to get to know that player better. And in recent seasons, including last year, you look at these last 6 years, and that includes 2021, where there weren't any official visits where prospects were flying in because of COVID protocols. But if you look at the last handful of years, 2018 is actually the only season where there were top 30 visits allowed. The Seahawks did not draft any of those players. Poona Ford was a player that they had for a top 30 visit that they ended up signing undrafted, became a really solid starter for the Seahawks for 5 years. But just the last 2 years alone, in 2022, Boye Mafe and Derek Young both were drafted by the Seahawks after top 30 visits. And this last year, Devin Witherspoon, Jarek Reed II, and Anthony Bradford all being selected by the Seahawks as well. This has been a really important part of the process, especially post-COVID. It feels like now that John Schneider and his staff, and maybe it's just the way the cards have fallen for them on draft weekend, and maybe this year they won't draft any players that they had in for top 30 visits. But it feels like since the COVID protocols were dropped and the Seahawks were able to reinstate these visits in-house at the VMAC or at Lumen Field, ever since they've been able to do that, it seems like John Schneider has been drafting more players that he brought in for those visits. And they talked about how much they loved their visit with Devin Witherspoon last year at the VMAC. That was a big part of their decision to decide, hey, we're going to go with a corner at number 5 instead of drafting somebody like Jalen Carter or a quarterback. There were a number of options at their table there, and they decided to go with Devin Witherspoon in large part because they already loved the prospect, but getting to know him better. Pete Carroll fell in love with him at that time. John Schneider loved his football IQ, the way he played the game, and just really enjoyed getting to know him better. This particular part of the process, again, it's 30 players coming in. Not all these guys are going to end up with the Seahawks. A large majority of them won't. It's 30 players. There's 32 teams, but there has been a strong correlation, whether it's players getting drafted. You look at some of the guys signed undrafted. Poona Ford, John Radigan, most recently. He was a player that had a top 30 visit with the Seahawks. They ended up signing him as an undrafted free agent. There are a number of players that have ended up in Seattle that had those meetings. And looking at other teams in the league, there are a lot of teams where they bring in guys in their top 30 visits and they don't have a very high rate of players that they end up drafting or signing as free agents. The Seahawks happen to be one of those teams that, especially in recent years, they have been investing more draft picks and signing players in undrafted ranks that they were more familiar with, that they had these visits with. So yes, there could be some smoke screens. Every year teams do that. They may bring in a prospect for a top 30 that is to suggest interest in a certain player when really they're hoping to get other teams to want to move up and get that player so someone else falls to them. That happens throughout the league during this time of year. It is smoke screen season, and yet at the same time, John Schneider has done this in free agency. He's done this with top 30 visits. He really loves the opportunity to bring these players in and actually meet with them in person to be able to get to know them and see medicals at their facility, all the things that go on in these top 30 visits. So what I'll say before I go into my rankings in the next segment is that the players that Seattle has reportedly brought in, and there's going to be a few more names that come in. John Schneider just said this on his weekly interview on Seattle Sports 710, that they're going to have up till next Thursday to host players for top 30 visits. So they still have a few of them that they are going to be bringing in here in coming days. But the players that they are bringing in for these visits are very much on the radar. This is not one of those cases, and maybe there's a few players that would fall in this line where they want to interview a player about another guy that they played with on their team that's in this draft class, things like that. There's way more to it than that, though, and the Seahawks clearly have placed an emphasis on this with 5 players in the last 2 years that they have drafted, and that's what we know. There are always a few that we don't find out about each year, so there may be some other guys been on Seattle's roster that were top 30 visitors, and we just didn't have reports on it. So this is certainly a big part of the equation. I would say, based on what we've seen, playing in the Senior Bowl and being brought out for a top 30 visit, those are clearly the 2 most important parts of this stage for the Seahawks in terms of the players they're drafting, and it bears out with the numbers in terms of the number of guys that they've been drafting under John Schneider. Who knows how much that changes, if at all, with Mike McDonald, but I'm anticipating that things are going to function the same in this regard. And the guys that came out for top 30s, a lot of these players are going to be high on the big board for the Seahawks, and we could see a few of them get drafted later this month when the draft takes place in Detroit. Up next, going to keep discussing these top 30 visits. The Seahawks have 19 players so far that have had visits reported. I'm going to be breaking down all 19 of those players, ranking them from 1 to 19, and having some projected round grades as well, where I think the Seahawks could get these players in the upcoming draft. We'll get to that here in a moment on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Again, that's $150, win or lose. You can bet on everything from Sidney Crosby slap shots to Aaron Judge home runs to LeBron James slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12. As always, greatly appreciate each and every one of you tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news from all the experts at Locked On, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As I just broke down, top 30 official visits. I don't necessarily love the name that has been given to them because, again, these are not the top 30 players, but they have been very important in the pre-draft process for the Seahawks. They've drafted 5 players that we know had top 30 visits just in the last 2 years alone. This is a key part of that pre-draft process. And so I want to look back at the 19 players so far that have been linked to the Seahawks that have had top 30 visits that have been reported. That includes a couple of quarterbacks that are expected to go in the first few rounds as well. And I'm going to be dishing out projected round grades and having brief analysis on where these players may fit for the Seahawks. So we're going to start at the bottom of the list and move up here. And I want to start here on our list at number 19. The final one of the prospects here, Travis Glover from Georgia State. And this is not a knock on any of these players. All of these guys are NFL caliber, or they would not be having visits with NFL teams. Travis Glover has over 4,000 career snaps to his name at Georgia State. He's played some guard. He's started games at both tackle positions, had a pretty poor pro day, gave up 4 sacks last year, could be a guard at the next level. But I see his ceiling being a guy that maybe can push for a roster spot as a backup. He's a 7th-round undrafted free agent candidate. I would give the same grade at number 18 to John Rice Plumlee from UCF. And this guy's a phenomenal athlete. I'm more intrigued by what a team like the Seahawks may choose to do with him moving in positions than I am him playing quarterback. I just don't see an NFL caliber passer. He's got arm talent. He was a baseball player playing at Ole Miss as well as UCF. So he's an incredible athlete, ran for a lot of yards in his college career. So I'm wondering if he could be a gadget type guy that maybe could make a team as a special teams player. He's just a phenomenal athlete. I don't see him being an NFL QB. You could practice squad him and try to develop him because there is some arm talent there, but nothing suggests to me that he's going to be an NFL quarterback. But his athleticism, his playmaking ability, the running background, maybe there's something that a team like the Seahawks could do with him where he could contribute to special teams and maybe give himself a chance to make the football team. The next 2 players I have on this list, heralding from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati at 17, Matt Gonzalez from Pittsburgh. We talked about him a little bit on yesterday's show. He has started quite a few games at tackle for the Panthers, missed most of last season with a toe injury. I think if he played all of last year or most of the season, that he might have a little higher projection, but this is a guy that didn't have a great pro day, only had 19 reps at 225 in the bench press. I look at him as a late day 3, maybe an undrafted player, but I've got him pegged in the 6th and 7th round. And I would have the same grade at number 16 for Juwan Briggs coming from Cincinnati. And this is a fun player at 310 pounds that started his career at Virginia, played 2 seasons where he was getting a lot of snaps early in his career with the Cavaliers against ACC competition. Transfers to Cincinnati the last 3 years. He has been one of the anchors of a defensive line for some pretty good defenses and had some decent pro day numbers as well. At 310 pounds, ran a 5.05 40-yard dash. So there are some reasons to be encouraged that this player, Briggs, could come in and maybe play some snaps for you fairly early because he is a seasoned 5-year collegiate player that played against Big 12 competition this last year. He played against the ACC early in his career. I view him as one of those high floor, low ceiling players that you can get late on day 3 that maybe has a chance to battle for a spot in your rotation early. So he's a guy that intrigues me from this list of players. Going to the next few on the list, Tyrese Knight coming out of UTEP. He is a freak athlete. You could see the playmaking ability. He played some outside linebacker, off-ball linebacker as well. He's very raw. There are a lot of plays that jump out to you thinking, man, this guy could be a really good NFL linebacker. And there are also a lot of plays where like, this guy's a draft prospect. So he is going to be a late round, 6th, 7th round player that is going to need some development from a good coaching staff to eliminate many of those plays that were not so good at the college level. Quantez Stiggers, this is an interesting one because he is not coming from a college. He did not play any college football. His father, unfortunately, was in a car accident and passed away several months after that car accident. He was depressed. He ended up dropping out of college. And then a few years later, he tried out for the fan-controlled football league and made a team. Then last year was with the Toronto Argonauts in the CFL and had 5 interceptions. He was the defensive rookie of the year in the CFL. Because he didn't play college ball and he's 22, he's more than 3 years removed from when he would have been eligible starting his college career. He's eligible for the draft. And so I think this is a guy that could go as early as the 5th round because there's clearly playmaking ability. And what a story we are talking about here with Stiggers. Certainly a fun player that could make some sense as a developmental player for the Seahawks. And the last 3 players I have here rounding out 19 through 11. Nathaniel Watson from Mississippi State has decent size and was an all-conference player in the SEC. I have questions about his coverage skills and his athleticism. So I think he's a mid-day 3 player despite all of the accolades that he has on his resume. And then Michael Dowell from Miami, Ohio. He actually started his career at Michigan State. This guy is a true strong safety. He's 6'1", 217 pounds. He ran a 4.52 40-yard dash at Miami's pro day. Had over 90 tackles 2 years ago, had 2 interceptions this season, and clearly has a good athletic profile. So I think this is a player looking in that 5th round range that's going to be the sweet spot. And because he's played against Big Ten competition, he's really athletic for his size. If Seattle's looking for a developmental strong safety, then I could see this kid being a really good fit. And Christian Boyd coming in at number 11. We talked about him some yesterday. Northern Iowa FCS product, but well over 300 pounds, really athletic, dominated in the East-West Shrine Bowl, really has put his name on the map. I could see him going as early as the 4th round because there is a significant drop-off after the first 3 rounds at that position. He could be one of those first guys taken on day 3 with a ton of untapped upside. As for the top 10 players here, my top 10 of the top 30 official visits for the Seahawks. Switching gears here to the more premium talent, Grayson Murphy, who has a twin that also plays at UCLA. I think that he's a player that is probably sweet spot is late 3rd, early 4th round. Had some good production at UCLA, had a very impressive pro day workout as well. The Seahawks love their Power 5 players. So I think Murphy could be one of those guys if they're looking to add to their edge group with an athletic player that has shown the ability to defend the run some. Grayson Murphy could certainly be a player to watch. My first quarterback here, my first legitimate quarterback prospect, again, nothing against John Rice Plumlee. I just think that he's a guy that's strictly developmental and maybe a position change is coming. Spencer Rattler coming in at number 9. He gets rattled, no pun intended here, with pressure at times, but he's tough. He's rock solid tough. Had a 28 touchdown season several years ago at Oklahoma. He's clearly got the arm talent. Didn't have the same talent around him roster-wise at South Carolina that he had at Oklahoma, and yet he put up some pretty solid numbers running that offense, and you watch the way through the combine. This feels like one of those guys that could be a third-round steal that still has some starter potential with the right team. And at number 8, Theo Johnson, my first tight end on here, ran in the 4.5s at 260 pounds, 6'5", 260, had 7 touchdowns for the Nittany Lions last year, emerged as a red zone threat. I think Seattle needs to attack the tight end position at some point in the middle rounds. Johnson, if they're wanting him, they might have to get him at pick 81, or if they trade down and recoup a pick, because I could see him going in the 3rd round in this draft class because he can block some. He's really athletic for his size, and he showed some receiving chops last year. So he is going to be a really fun player to watch here. At number 7, Malachi Corley. I actually have a lower round projection on him than Spencer Rattler or Theo Johnson, but I like the prospect. It's just the depth at the receiver position from Western Kentucky. This guy is a yards after the catch maestro. He was as good at creating yardage after the catch as anybody in the nation the last couple of years, put up some really gaudy numbers for the Hilltoppers. Had a solid pro day workout as well. The Seahawks met with him early in this process. They don't necessarily need a receiver, but Tyler Lockett's not getting any younger. Corley could be another one of those players that's really fun in Ryan Grubb's offense. And my highest rated QB of the visits, it's Bo Nix. I think there's certainly some things you can nitpick. I wonder what he's going to be able to do in a pro-style offense after we saw these past few years that he really had an RPO-centric offense at Oregon, and that helped him a lot. Get the football out quickly. Didn't have as many plays where he had to make reads, but you can't deny the athleticism, the running ability. He's got arm talent. He threw just 3 picks last year with 45 touchdowns. He's a player that could sneak into the 1st round. I've got a 2nd-round grade on him for this exercise. And for our top 5, Cameron Kinchens, we talked about him some on yesterday's show. He's one of the later top 30 visits that's been reported, 11 picks in the last 2 years. There are some lowlights on his film. He didn't run very well at the combine, had a lackluster workout in general, but you watch the tape and you see a playmaker. I still think he goes in round 2 or 3 on day 2. T'Vondre Sweat from Texas, as well as Byron Murphy II. I've got both of Texas' defensive tackles in my top 5. Sweat because of the DWI charge, the arrest recently, and the fact that there are some question marks about his weight at 366 pounds. Is he going to be able to stay in shape at the next level? I do have some question marks, and yet this is a damn good football player that can overpower people. He's got really good athleticism for a player that size. Can disrupt the pocket, can get a few sacks for you, could be more than just a early down nose tackle. Byron Murphy's got running back background in his resume. You can see it with that quick first step, and I think his best football's in front of him. So those 2 guys certainly high on my list as well. And rounding out the top 5, Chop Robinson, this is more of a projection. He is that guy that's got the super high ceiling with his athletic traits at 250-plus pounds. Was a first-team All-Big Ten selection. You're waiting for the sack numbers. I could see him being a much better sack producer in the NFL than what he was at Maryland and Penn State in his college career. And Jared Verse, to me, he is the only top 10 selection that the Seahawks, at least by my grades, he's the only top 10 selection that Seattle has had for a top 30 visit, but he could fall to the Seahawks at 16 because this is a quarterback-driven class. This is an offensive line-driven class. There's a lot of really good receivers. You could see some defenders that go in the top 10 other years fall into the teens, and Verse is a player that I would strongly consider picking, especially with the drop-off with Uchenna Nwosu's injury last year. They need another defensive end, outside linebacker that can defend the run. This kid can do that. He's explosive off the line. He can win with power. And we're talking about a guy that went from Albany in the FCS division and immediately became an absolute. There was no growing pains there. He became one of the best players in the entire conference, and he could have been a top 15 pick a year ago. I think he has solidified his standing as a top 10 pick, but he could fall because of the structure of this class for some other positions. If he falls into that 16 range, Seattle may have to consider twice about trading back. So he is the top prospect for me of these 19 reported visits. Up next, going to switch gears to my favorite position, the running back spot. And don't worry, 12s, I'm not talking day 1 or day 2 prospects, because I know the Seahawks have done that the last couple of years. I would be stunned if they take a running back earlier than day 3. We are going to look at some day 3 prospects that I'm really excited about. That'll be coming up next year on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, it's what brings home the winning trophy, and it also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. If you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors, they've got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for, and eBay's guaranteed fit guarantees that it's going to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s. As always, thank you for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Switching gears to our NFL draft preview. Now, I would love to talk about first round, second round, third round running backs, just because it is my favorite position. It's what I played. It's what I coached at the high school level. But the Seahawks have picked a running back in the second round each of the past 2 years. I do not see John Schneider doing that again this year, especially without a second round pick right now. Maybe that's a good thing, because John Schneider won't be thinking he's got to draft a running back. With that said, Seattle lost DJ Dallas in free agency, and they also just lost Bryant Koback, who was a practice squad guy last year. He was placed on the retired reserve list. So you've got 3 running backs on the entire roster right now. And as Seattle's history shows, you'd like to have at least 4 running backs who are capable of toting the rock on Sundays on your roster. I could still see this being a position where John Schneider drafts somebody on day 3. So let's get to some of the best day 3 prospects, in my opinion, that would be good fits for the Seahawks. And starting off with number 1 on my list here, a local product, Bucky Irving from Oregon. Probably one of my favorite prospects in this class at the running back position, just because I love the way that he runs. He's only 192 pounds. He's a smaller back, but don't let that fool you. This guy grinds out yards like he's a 220-pound back, and he ranked 3rd in the entire country last year, according to Pro Football Focus, in yards after contact. I saw this little guy drive much bigger linebackers, safeties, even defensive ends a couple yards downfield. He is not going to be a home run hitter. Ran in the 4.5, high 4.5s. This isn't a guy that's going to rack up a bunch of 15-plus yard runs, but he can be one of those chain movers that is also going to break a lot of tackles. And he only had 1 fumble in his entire college career, so he's good holding on to the football as well. I think an early day 3 candidate that plays bigger than his size and really fits what the Seahawks are probably going to be looking to do in Ryan Grubb's offense. Coming in next on my list, Marshawn Lloyd. We've got to have a Marshawn on this list with the Marshawn Lynch history. This is a totally different back than Bucky Irving, who really cuts his teeth breaking tackles. Marshawn Lloyd is a legitimate 4.45, 40-yard dash speed running back on the field. And he had the highest breakaway percentage, or 15-plus yard runs on design runs last year in the entire country. So this is a guy that can hit a lot of home runs for you out of the backfield. He's a little bit too much of a freelancer for my liking at times. He makes it work against college competition. NFL, you get a wake-up call with that. But You can see the burst. You can see the explosiveness. He's got really soft hands out of the backfield. So as far as being a third down back candidate, he would certainly be somebody that would make sense. Kamani Vidal, we've talked about a lot on this podcast. He is probably my favorite running back prospect in this entire class, but he is probably going in day 3 unless the NFL scouts out there are much higher than most of the draft pundits out there are on him, which I would get it because this kid, I've just been blown away by it. He led the country in missed tackles forced by 20 last year. Nobody was within 20 of him, according to Pro Football Focus. He led the country in yards after contact, over 1,000 yards after contact. And he's built like a brick, but he doesn't necessarily run like one. He's a 4.4 guy that has the speed to be able to pick up chunks on the ground, and he's still going to look to punish you. He's going to dish out the punishment instead of going out of bounds. Again, I've said this before. I see some Thomas Rawls in his game, former Seahawks running back, with better ball carrier vision, and this is the best pass blocking running back that I have evaluated in 10 years in this business. He is phenomenal picking up blitzes, plays with great technique. He's a physical presence. He knows who he needs to pick up. He's as polished of a pass protector as I've seen coming into the league. So if you're looking for a third down back, nothing flashy as a pass catcher. He's not going to be somebody you move out of the slot and do stuff like that with, but he can catch the football and he can make some plays in that capacity. This is a really good running back coming from Troy. The next 2 players on my list, we've got Missouri and Southern Mississippi. We've got Cody Schrader, ran a 4.6 140 at the combine. He is not a burner. This is not a guy that is going to be hitting a lot of big runs in the NFL, but he breaks a lot of tackles, ranked in the top 5 in yards created after contact. He's got really good contact balance. I think he is a good change of pace runner at the next level. And you think you could make the same argument for Frank Gore Jr., the son of former 49ers star Frank Gore, not as big as what his dad was, but he runs with the same tenacity. You wouldn't think that he only weighs 201 pounds. He runs hard. He's physical. He ranked in the top 10 in yards after contact and yards after contact per rush, forced a lot of missed tackles, but he ran a 4.69 at his pro day, did not participate in the workout at the combine in Indy. He is not the athlete that is going to be a feature back, but with the tenacity, the ability to break tackles, really good hands out of the backfield, and he's a better pass protector than a lot of guys in this class. I think mid-rounds on day 3, round 5, round 6, maybe early 7th, that would be the sweet spot here. The pedigree obviously is going to help him. This is a really good football player that just doesn't have as much juice as a lot of the other running backs. But I think as a third down or a short yardage guy, that there's some value here with Frank Gore Jr. And rounding out my 3 other ones that I think would be good fits for the Seahawks on day 3, Ray Davis from Kentucky. Ironically, I see a lot of Mike Davis in his game, former Seahawks running back. He's a very compactly built player, 211 pounds at 5'11". He will pop you. Not a guy that's going to outrun safeties and corners. A little more athletic than I thought at his combine workout. Pass protection's the biggest issue with him. He's going to have to figure that out to become a running back in the NFL that's going to get consistent reps, but he's got really good hands out of the backfield. He is a hard-nosed, tough runner that is going to bulldoze through people, broke a lot of tackles. He fits that punishing mindset that the Seahawks have looked for. And Dylan Johnson, he's a local kid, played at Washington last year. Husky fans are going to be very familiar with him. I look at him as a high floor, low ceiling player. And what I mean by that is he's very polished coming into the league. This is a tough-minded kid that played through injuries last year, rushed for over 1,000 yards for the Huskies, double-digit rushing touchdowns. He is that between the tackles runner that isn't going to juke people out in space consistently. He's not going to make guys miss with his elusiveness. He's not going to hit a lot of home runs, not a guy that's going to break a lot of long runs, but he is one of those guys that can pick up chunks where he can move the chains, and he's a volume runner. So I could see him being another player that maybe the Seahawks have interest reuniting him with Ryan Grubb as a depth piece that can run between the tackles, can be that featured back. You're just not going to get a guy that's going to be a star by any means because he ran a 4.68, not overly explosive, but he does a lot of the really good things running the football, and he's got good vision. So he's a player that I think there should be some excitement about. And my last back real quick, Tyrone Tracy from Purdue. He actually started his college career at Iowa as a receiver. I coached against him. No bias here. This guy is an explosive athlete at 210 pounds. Last year averaged 4.44 yards after contact per carry. Only had 114 carries. Was not an extensive workhorse back, but he had 25 runs on those 114 carries that went for 10 or more yards. So he is one of those players, anytime he touches the ball, he can be real dangerous in space. And this is a guy that also ran in the 4.4s. His receiving background, you can do a lot of fun stuff moving him around the formation. And he returned a kickoff for a touchdown last year. So he adds the special teams component as well. I'm looking at him as a 6th, 7th round player who doesn't have a lot of tread in his tires as a running back, which is a good thing. He's going to have he's going to be fresh. He's going to have a lot of carries left in him coming into the league. And he's also going to give you that multiplicity as a receiver that you can move around the formation. You can have him return kicks and punts. There's a lot of fun stuff that you can do with this kid. So I could see him being a player now that he has found a position at running back. I could see him being a better pro than a college player. And this guy's got a pretty high ceiling in the right system as a gadget player on offense and a special teams standout. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to ensure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, I'll be joined by my friend Nick Lee for Blue Friday. The two of us are going to dive in on the defensive side of the football, edge rushers, as we continue our 2024 NFL draft preview. We'll be looking at first rounders, day 2 studs, and of course our day 3 sleepers. Make sure that you're listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Go Hawks.